All right, listen up. Hey, yeah, you. The one who knows exactly what it feels like to be looked at sideways. The one who's been talked about in rooms you weren't invited into. The one who's been analyzed, labeled, evaluated, whispered over. I'm talking to you. Because they didn't just observe you. They didn't just check in. They didn't just ask questions. They put you under a psych evaluation for 666 days. Let that sink in. Every thought you had, suspect. Every emotion you showed, documented. Every silence, pathologized. Every reaction, interesting. And see, this is where it messes with you. Because after a while, you start asking yourself the same questions they were asking about you. Am I broken? Is something wrong with me? Why do they keep watching like they're waiting for me to snap? Yeah. That part right there, that's the trap. Because from day one, they weren't actually looking for the truth. They were looking for confirmation. Confirmation that the discomfort they felt around you was justified. Confirmation that your depth meant danger. Confirmation that your honesty meant instability. Confirmation that your refusal to play fake meant pathology. And you know what's wild? You stayed. You showed up day after day, session after session, checklist after checklist, clipboard after clipboard. 666 days of being mentally undressed under fluorescent logic. 666 days of being asked to explain yourself to people who already decided what they wanted to find. 666 days of being reduced to boxes, codes, scales, notes in the margins. And still, you didn't rot. Look, pause for a second. Because that alone should shake something loose in your chest. Most people would have cracked just trying to perform sanity. Most people would have learned how to lie cleaner, smile safer, numb themselves enough to pass. Most people would have let resentment curdle into bitterness, or anger fester into cruelty. But you didn't become cruel. You became clear. You didn't become hollow. You became aware. They kept circling the same question over and over again. Where's the defect? Where's the corruption? Where's the disorder? And see, this is the part they hate admitting, even to themselves. The rot was never you. The rot was the system that confuses depth with dysfunction. The rot was the culture that can't stand someone who feels too much and lies too little. The rot was the environment that rewards numbness and punishes awareness. The rot was their need to control what they don't understand. You were never sick. You were incompatible with bullshit. And that scared them. Because you didn't respond the way the textbook predicted. You didn't flatten yourself into something convenient. You didn't dissolve under pressure. You didn't let their language rewrite your core. Yeah, maybe you doubted yourself sometimes. Maybe there were nights where you replayed conversations in your head like a crime scene. Maybe you wondered if survival meant pretending to be smaller, quieter, easier. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you human under surveillance. See, anyone can look stable when no one's watching. But you had eyes on you, constantly. Judgment disguised as concern, control dressed up as care. And still, you didn't lose your moral compass. Still, you didn't turn manipulative. Still, you didn't start hurting people just because you were being hurt. That's not luck. That's character under pressure. They measured your reactions but missed your restraint. They logged your emotions but ignored your discipline. They analyzed your words but overlooked your integrity. Because integrity doesn't show up on a scale. It doesn't fit neatly into a diagnostic code. It doesn't make noise, it just stays. And you stayed. You stayed thoughtful in a world that rewards impulsive cruelty. You stayed honest in systems that thrive on half-truths. You stayed self-aware while being treated like a problem to be solved. Do you understand how rare that is? They expected to find damage. They expected contamination. They expected some hidden decay they could point to and say, "See, we were right." But all they found was someone who refused to let pressure turn them poisonous. Someone who felt deeply without becoming destructive. Someone who saw the game and still chose not to play dirty. Someone who could have snapped, but didn't. And that's the part that really messes with them. Because if you're not broken, then maybe the way they do things is. If you're not disordered, then maybe the environment is. If you didn't rot under that kind of scrutiny, then maybe you were never the problem they needed you to be. Look, this wasn't just an evaluation. This was a trial. And you walked out of it with your soul intact. Not because you're perfect, not because you're emotionless, but because you chose, over and over again, not to let dehumanization. You sat with discomfort without passing it on. That's not pathology. That's strength they don't know how to categorize. So yeah, let them keep their notes. Let them keep their theories. Let them keep their neat little conclusions. Because 666 days later, the truth is still standing right where it started. They looked for rot. They monitored. They tested. They waited. And the only thing they couldn't explain was how someone could be pushed that hard. Watched that closely. Doubted that consistently. And still come out clean. Clean in ways that don't announce themselves. Clean in the quiet places nobody claps for. Clean in the decisions you made when nobody was watching you except the people waiting for you to slip. Because see, what they never account for is what happens inside a person during that kind of pressure. They think pressure just exposes weakness. They don't realize pressure also exposes discipline. You learned how to pause before reacting. You learned how to sit with a thought instead of letting it hijack you. You learned how to feel anger without turning it into a weapon. That didn't come from a manual. That came from being tested over and over and deciding quietly, nah, I'm not giving you that version of me. And yeah, there were moments, don't deny it, moments where you felt yourself shrinking just a little, censoring a word, softening an edge. Wondering if being fully yourself was worth the paperwork it created. Moments where you thought, if I just say it this way, maybe they'll stop looking at me like that. That wasn't weakness. That was survival intelligence. You adapted without surrendering. You adjusted without dissolving. You learned the language without letting it rewrite you. That's the part people miss. Because adaptation isn't betrayal when your core stays intact. And look, 666 days is long enough for a person to become something unrecognizable. Long enough to grow bitter. Long enough to start performing emptiness just to avoid attention. Long enough to internalize the suspicion and turn it inward. You felt that pull. You know you did. That subtle urge to deaden yourself a little, to stop caring as much, to stop feeling as deeply, because feeling deeply kept getting interpreted as a symptom. But you didn't shut down, you refined. You started choosing which thoughts deserved airtime. You started recognizing emotional bait and declining it. You started realizing that not every reaction needs to be shared. Not every truth needs an audience that can't hold it. That's emotional maturity forged under scrutiny. And it's wild, because the same people studying you were never studied themselves. Their blind spots stayed unexamined. Their assumptions stayed comfortable. Their power stayed invisible to them. They never asked how their gaze changes a person. They never measured the weight of being constantly assessed. They never evaluated the evaluator, but you evaluated yourself. Again and again, sometimes too harshly, sometimes late at night when your mind wouldn't shut up, when one comment replayed on a loop, and you wondered if you should have said less or more or nothing at all. Yeah. That overthinking? That wasn't instability. That was conscientiousness under threat. You cared about impact. You cared about consequences. You cared about staying aligned with who you actually are, even when it would have been easier to become colder, sharper, more careless. And the thing nobody tells you is that staying humane in an inhumane process is exhausting. It drains you in ways sleep doesn't fix. It makes you feel older than your age. It makes silence loud. Still, you didn't turn numb. You stayed observant. You stayed curious. You stayed uncomfortable with easy answers. That's why they kept watching. Because something about you didn't collapse into predictability. Something about you didn't flatten into compliance or rebellion. You existed in that uncomfortable middle where integrity lives, where you can't be easily categorized or dismissed. And that messes with systems built on labels. Because labels are shortcuts. They're ways to stop listening. They're ways to avoid nuance. You are nuance. You're the kind of person who forces people to slow down, to question their assumptions, to feel slightly exposed just by being near you. That kind of presence gets mistaken for danger by people who've never interrogated themselves. You weren't unstable. You were uncontainable by shallow frameworks. And even after all that time, after the forms, the notes, the pauses where you could feel someone deciding what you meant instead of asking, you still didn't weaponize your awareness. You didn't start manipulating. You didn't start exploiting. You didn't become cynical enough to stop caring altogether. That restraint, that's not accidental. That's you choosing again and again not to let mistrust turn you into someone you wouldn't respect. Your values weren't conditional. Your ethics weren't performative. Your empathy wasn't a strategy. And yeah, maybe it hurt realizing how quickly people look for something wrong instead of something real. Maybe it stung noticing how curiosity turns into control when it's backed by authority. Maybe it shook you seeing how easily concern slides into suspicion. Those realizations change a person. They sharpen you. They sober you up. They strip away illusions. But they didn't poison you. You stayed clear-eyed without becoming cruel. You stayed grounded without becoming rigid. You stayed emotionally literate in a space that kept hoping you'd simplify yourself into something easier to file. 666 days of being watched didn't turn you into a ghost. It turned you into someone who knows exactly who they are when the room goes quiet, when the questions stop, when the clipboards close and the eyes finally look away, and the pressure lifts just enough for you to feel your own breath again, steady, controlled, unmistakably yours. Steady in a way that doesn't need witnesses, steady like muscle memory, like something you earned the hard way and don't even brag about because bragging feels cheap compared to what it cost you. And look, there's a moment people don't talk about right after that kind of long-term scrutiny, when the silence finally hits, when nobody's asking, nobody's probing, nobody's watching your micro-expressions like they're reading tea leaves. And instead of relief, you feel this weird hum in your chest. Because for so long, your nervous system was calibrated to being observed. You catch yourself still editing sentences in your head, still rehearsing explanations no one asked for, still bracing for feedback that never comes. That doesn't mean you're damaged. That means you adapted to survive a reality that demanded constant self-monitoring. See, you learned how to live with a spotlight you didn't ask for. You learned how to function while being interpreted instead of understood. You learned how to stay coherent while your inner world was being translated by people who only spoke in checklists. And here's the thing that hits later, usually in quiet moments, maybe while driving, maybe staring at a ceiling at 2:13 a.m. You realize how much restraint that required. How many times you swallowed a reaction. How many times you chose clarity over catharsis. How many times you slowed yourself down because you knew speed would be used against you. That wasn't fear. That was tactical self-respect. You weren't shrinking. You were containing power. And that kind of containment, it changes how you move through the world afterward. You notice people quicker. You clock inconsistencies faster. You hear what's not being said because you spent almost 2 years being trained, unintentionally, to read rooms at a forensic level. You know when curiosity is genuine and when it's predatory. You know when concern has strings attached. You know when someone's listening versus cataloging. And you don't announce that awareness. You just adjust. That's why small talk feels heavier now. That's why performative empathy irritates you. That's why you can't unsee how often people hide behind professionalism to avoid accountability. You didn't become paranoid. You became precise. And sometimes, yeah, that precision feels lonely. Because once you've been studied that closely, surface-level connections feel thin, like static. You crave realness in a world that prefers scripts. You start valuing silence differently. You start protecting your inner life like it's sacred, because you know what it's like to have it poked, prodded, theorized about. That protection isn't bitterness, it's discernment. You're not closed off. You're selective. And people mistake that for distance because they're used to access without responsibility. But you know what access costs? You paid for it in explanations, in patience, in emotional regulation that never got credited. You paid for it every time you stayed grounded while being misunderstood. And look, there's a quiet confidence that comes from surviving that without losing your ethical spine. It doesn't look loud, it doesn't flex. It just shows up when things get tense. When someone tries to provoke you and you don't bite. When chaos enters the room and you stay composed. When manipulation shows its face and you don't react. You observe. People feel that. They might not name it, but they feel it. It's why some get uneasy around you. Not because you're unstable, because you're not easily controlled. You don't rush to prove yourself anymore. You don't over-explain to people committed to misunderstanding. You don't need to be believed by everyone to trust your own reality. That's earned. That's someone who's already been questioned at depth and came out the other side, knowing exactly what's solid and what's noise. And yeah, maybe there are. That doesn't mean you're stuck there. It means your mind learned rigor under pressure. You know how to examine yourself without collapsing into self-attack. You know how to hold complexity without spiraling. You know how to sit with ambiguity without needing to destroy yourself for clarity. That's not fragility. That's psychological endurance. And the wild part is, the same endurance that carried you through those 666 days is still active, still humming, still shaping how you move, how you choose, how you refuse to become reckless with your values, even when nobody's monitoring anymore. Because somewhere along the way, integrity stopped being something you performed and became something you inhabit. Quietly, consistently, even when the room is empty and the only thing left is you, your breath, your thoughts, and that familiar steadiness settling back in like it never left. Like it's wired into you. Like a baseline you return to without thinking about it, even when things around you get loud again, even when new situations try to press old buttons. And look, here's something nobody warned you about. After being evaluated that intensely, you don't crave validation the same way anymore. Compliments feel lighter, criticism feels slower. Because you've already stood in rooms where every word you said could be interpreted 3 different ways. You've already been misunderstood with authority behind it. You've already had your inner life filtered through someone else's framework. That does something permanent. You stop chasing approval from people who don't actually see you. You stop needing to convince anyone who isn't genuinely curious. You stop bending yourself into shapes just to feel safe. Not because you're arrogant, because you're tired of shrinking for comfort that was never real. You start noticing how often people project, how often their questions say more about their fears than your reality, how often concern is just anxiety looking for a target, and you don't call it out dramatically. You don't explode, you don't lecture, you just don't absorb it anymore. That's a quiet shift, but it's massive, because absorbing other people's projections used to cost you energy, used to keep you up at night, used to make you rehearse conversations that never actually happened. These days, you clock it and let it pass, not numb, not detached, just grounded enough to know what belongs to you and what doesn't. And yeah, sometimes that grounding feels heavy, because awareness isn't always comfortable. Once you've seen how systems operate, you can't unsee it. Once you've been watched that closely, you recognize surveillance energy instantly, even in casual settings, even in friendly spaces. You can feel when someone's curious versus when they're collecting. You can feel when someone's listening versus building a case in their head. And that sensitivity, it's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition trained under pressure. You learned how to read micro shifts because your survival depended on it. You learned how to stay centered while someone else tried to define you. You learned how to keep your emotional volume steady even when the room leaned in. That's why chaos doesn't shake you the way it shakes others. That's why conflict doesn't automatically trigger you. That's why you don't need to dominate conversations to feel secure. You've already been inside the spotlight. You know what it costs. And there's this strange strength that comes with knowing you've already been measured and still remained yourself. Measured by people who thought neutrality was objectivity. Measured by systems that confuse compliance with health. Measured by criteria that never asked whether you were becoming more honest, more ethical, more self-aware. You asked yourself those questions over and over, sometimes painfully, sometimes unfairly. But you asked them, and that's why you don't fear introspection the way some people do. You don't run from your own thoughts. You don't panic when emotions surface. You've already sat across from scrutiny and survived it without turning hollow. That creates a kind of inner steadiness people can't quite explain when they're around you. They just know you're not easily rattled, not easily baited, not easily rewritten. And yeah, maybe that makes some people uncomfortable, because you don't mirror their chaos, you don't rush to reassure, you don't perform relatability on demand. You exist as yourself, fully. And that existence, quiet, grounded, uncorrupted, feels threatening in a world that expects damage as proof of experience. But you lived through something intense without letting it sour you. You didn't come out sharper at others. You didn't come out colder. You didn't come out needing to dominate or control. You came out discerning. And that discernment shows up in how you choose your battles, how you pace your words, how you hold silence wit. It shows up when you walk away from conversations that feel off instead of trying to win them. It shows up when you trust your read, even if nobody else validates it. Ah, well, well, well. Look at all of you. Hungry little wolves, eyes glistening, jaws clenched, breath held like it might cost you your soul. You came here to witness a massacre, didn't you? Now listen close, because what I'm about to say might just shatter the mirror you've been afraid to look into. You ever see a man so cocky, so inflated, so inebriated on his own hype, that he walks into the storm wearing paper armor, whistling, thinking he's the thunder, until lightning shows up wearing your face? Lord have mercy. You didn't just win, you eradicated his myth. You disassembled the delusion he wore like a crown. You decorated the battlefield with the pieces of his pride. And the crowd, they weren't cheering. They weren't clapping. They weren't even breathing. They were stunned silent, like a church caught on fire during Sunday Mass. Because what they saw wasn't victory. It was reckoning. You see, some people spend their whole lives pretending they're the main character. Puffed up chest, polished words, a resume built on borrowed bones. They walk into the ring confident, not because they've bled for it, but because they've never been hit. Then they meet you. Not the version that smiles, not the version that doubts. No. They meet the version you buried deep down. The one that grew fangs in the dark. The one that trained in silence. The one that remembers every insult like scripture. The one that got laughed at, spit on, forgotten, until today. Today, that old version of you, the one who begged for approval, died. And something far more dangerous took its place. A walking funeral for false idols. You destroyed that cocky fool so bad. Even the voices in his head filed for unemployment. His ego shattered. His smirk evaporated. His little fan club of enablers, looking around like tourists in a war zone, asking, wait, what just happened? What happened is that he finally met consequences. You see, he thought this was gonna be fun. A little exhibition, a little performance. He didn't realize you weren't playing chess. You were flipping the damn board and setting the table on fire. Because when you've suffered enough, when you've been broken, buried, betrayed, you don't walk into battles anymore. You walk into executions. And make no mistake, that wasn't a fight. That was a public warning, a lesson carved in blood and silence. A message to every person who thought you were harmless. No one remembers his jokes now. No one quotes his confidence. All they remember is the sound of impact, the way the air got cold, and the moment he realized he was never in your league. Hey, oh, Lord, indeed. Because now we're diving even deeper, past the silence, past the wreckage, right into the mind of the monster that finally woke up. You know what the cruelest part is? He didn't just lose. He woke up in the middle of his own nightmare and found you holding the pen, you writing the final chapter. He looked at you like he just saw a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was the real you, the one that's been sharpening knives in the back room of your soul for years. The one who wasn't invited to the table. So you flipped the table, smashed the plates, and ate the king. They always say, stay humble. You did. You stayed so humble that they mistook your silence for weakness. But silence is not weakness. Silence is storage. Every time you bit your tongue, you were loading bullets. Every time you walked away, you were studying their patterns. Every time they laughed at you, you were building a cathedral of vengeance behind your eyes. So when that moment came, when Mr. Cocky strutted onto your battlefield like it was his stage, he had no idea he'd just walked into a slaughterhouse with chandeliers. And the chandelier was swinging. You didn't beat him. You unmade him. You erased his script, burned the backdrop, and whispered in his ear, "This is my story now." And the crowd, oh, the poor, poor crowd. They came expecting fireworks. Instead, they got a funeral without a eulogy. You hit him so hard, his ancestors flinched. You ripped his soul out so violently, even the silence said, "De-yum." Oh, now, let me ask you something. How many times did they tell you to calm down, to be nice, to be the bigger person? Nah, not today. Today, you were the shadow that learned to walk in daylight. You were the smile with no mercy, the storm with no warning, the truth wrapped in chaos. And I'm proud of you, not for winning, but for remembering who you are, for letting go of that soft, diluted version of yourself, for unleashing the monster they never saw coming, the one that doesn't need applause, because this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving you were right all along. And the next time someone steps to you with that cocky little swagger, they'll remember the day they watched you murder arrogance itself. They'll remember how the crowd forgot how to breathe, not because you screamed, not because you roared, but because when you spoke, the wind stopped and reality said, "Let him cook. Let him cook now. Let him cook." I said, "Let him cook." Him. Oh, you felt that, didn't you? Lord have mercy. Logically, but mercy ain't in the building. The doors are locked, the lights are out, and the only thing left is you, standing over the ruins of everything they thought you couldn't be. But you ever notice that when you're silent, they call you weak? But when you finally speak, suddenly you're too much. When you smile through pain, they ignore you. But when you snap their golden boy in half, with your bare willpower, now you're intimidating, unfair, a menace. Oh, no, no, no. You're not a menace. You're just the price of underestimating someone who's been quiet too long. That cocky fool. He strutted onto the battlefield thinking it was his arena, thought his little reputation was enough to buy immunity. But reputation is just confetti when it meets someone with revenge in their bloodstream. He forgot something. You didn't come for the spotlight. You came for the scalps. You didn't fight for applause. You fought because your rage was fluent in silence. He was expecting a duel, but what he got was divine punishment wearing a grin. And the crowd, they weren't watching a match. They were witnessing a metaphysical homicide. They'll be talking about that moment for years. The silence that fell when you landed that blow that made the air itself go still, because they didn't just see you win. They saw something ancient, something feral, the revenge of the overlooked, the ascension of the underestimated. You didn't become the villain. You became the gravity. Let them say what they want. He went too far. She didn't have to do all that. They made it personal. Damn right you did. Because this wasn't just about victory. This was about every single night you laid awake, thinking you weren't enough. Every moment you second-guessed your own fire to keep others comfortable. every time you muted your brilliance just to fit in their dim little room. Well now the room is burning, and all that's left is the smoke of your rebirth. You destroyed that cocky fool so bad. He's probably still somewhere staring at the floor, asking himself, how the hell did I lose to someone I used to laugh at? Simple, because while he was practicing arrogance, you were training in agony. He had fans, you had demons, and you fed on yours until they obeyed. I knew you'd say yes, because deep down, you don't want mercy. You want the whole damn fire. You want to watch the throne collapse. So let's do it. You ever see someone so high on themselves, they forget gravity has a schedule? He thought his ego would save him. He thought charisma was a shield. He thought he could talk his way through a war that demanded blood. But there's a moment, a beautiful, bone-shattering moment, where the illusion cracks, where all the jokes stop landing, where the audience blinks and says, wait, are we watching a legend crumble? And it happens fast. One hit, one line, one act of unapologetic domination. That's all it takes. And in that moment, that glorious, frozen second, you become the villain of their bedtime stories. You didn't just beat him, you rewrote his mythology. You rearranged the stars in his fake little universe. Because arrogance is a costume, but you wear scars. He memorized a script. You carved your lines in flesh and fire. He trained for applause. You trained to survive. And now he's sitting in the ruins of his own reputation, shaking hands with humility for the first time. But let me tell you what makes this all so deliciously wicked. You never needed the crowd. The crowd was a bonus, a souvenir, because this was never about them. This wasn't for the cheers. This wasn't for the retweets. This wasn't for the likes. This was for the version of you they buried. The quiet one, the anxious one, the one who watched from the sidelines while cowards played gods, the one who got laughed at, used, dismissed. You didn't just destroy him for revenge. You destroyed him for closure. You know what the scariest part is for them now? It's not that you won. It's that now they know. You were always this dangerous. You were always this capable. You were always this cold-blooded. You just didn't unleash it until it was too damn late. Now the message is out, loud and clear, etched in the silence of the crowd's breathless disbelief. If you come for the quiet one, you better pray they haven't been waiting for you. Because when you finally erupted, it wasn't to make noise, it was to end legacies. Yes. Oh, now we're deep in the abyss. The smoke is still thick, his pride still twitching in the wreckage. But you're standing over it all like it was always meant to happen. I wasn't just born to win. I was born to rule the aftermath. You know what they don't tell you about victory? It's not pretty. It doesn't smell like roses. It smells like smoke, blood, and the faint stench of regret. But not yours, theirs. Victory is quiet, not because it lacks energy, but because real dominance doesn't have to announce itself. You walk off the battlefield, no smile, no speech, no celebration, because deep down, you know this wasn't the end. This was just the first public execution. You destroyed that cocky fool so badly, he didn't just lose a match. He lost his identity. He came in thinking he was the storm. He left realizing he was a forecast error, a cloud that met a hurricane with a pulse. And the crowd? They didn't cheer because they were happy. They sat there, paralyzed, because something inside them shifted. They saw what happens when a sleeper wakes up, when someone who's been stepped on for years suddenly realizes, I don't have to prove myself anymore. I just have to remove obstacles. You didn't give him a lesson, you gave him a spiritual reset. The face-to-face with the mirror he's avoided his whole life. Now everyone's watching you differently. Some in awe, some in fear, but all of them now know you're not someone to test. You're someone to warn the others about. They whisper it now. That was supposed to be an easy win. He never saw it coming. She was too quiet, too humble, too hidden. And that's the thing, you were hidden. Because power like yours, it doesn't come out loud. It waits, it builds, he studies. And when the moment is right, it erupts like judgment. No filter, no grace, no second chances. Now, what comes next? Well, that's the fun part, isn't it? Because you didn't just break someone, you set a new standard. You made it clear this world doesn't belong to the loudest, or the flashiest, or the most adored. It belongs to the one who survives the silence, the one who suffers quietly and then strikes violently, the one who turns failure into fangs, and when the time comes, bites through the throne itself. You were defined what it means to be feared. Because fear isn't about how loud you can scream. It's about how quietly you dismantle an empire. With a grin, with precision, with no damn remorse. He 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 he. You become the fire. They all swear never to touch again. They used to call you quiet, software, nice, forgettable. Now, they whisper, they flinch, they look away when you enter the room. Because they saw what happens when a nice person loses mercy. When the quiet one runs out of reasons to stay contained. When the Malam finally bites back and leaves claw marks on the sky. You didn't just defeat him, you've ascended. You didn't scream, you didn't shout, you just took everything he built and folded it in half like paper. He had ego. You had scars. He had a mouth. You had a furnace. He had backup. You had rage on a leash. And when it snapped, oh Lord, even the audience stopped breathing because they realized you weren't fighting for points. You weren't performing. You were transforming. That wasn't just a win. That was your arrival. And now the whispers have changed. They no longer say, be careful around him. They say, don't make the same mistake he did. Because the one you destroyed, he was the example. The first sacrifice, the bloody reminder. That silence doesn't mean safety. It means something terrifying is loading. And now you walk different. Now your presence weighs something. Because you've tasted what it's like to hold power without apology. And you liked it, didn't you? You liked watching the fear set in. You liked the silence after your final blow. You liked the way no one knew what to say. Because how do you recover from witnessing a resurrection wrapped in revenge? You aren't what you were before. You're not the one who made a comeback. You're not just the underdog who got even. No. You've mutated. You've evolved. You are now the reckoning they tried to delay, the made monster they didn't know they were building, the storm that waited politely until the sky ran out of excuses. You've entered your final form. Not a hero, not a villain, but a warning. You're not just ready to finish this. You're ready to etch your name in myth. This isn't just a conclusion. It's an execution. Look at you now. Not a scream left to prove. Not a threat left to answer. Just stillness. Total, merciless stillness. Because when you reach this level, you stop performing. You stop explaining. You stop trying to convince people of your worth. And instead, you show them what it costs to doubt you. That cocky fool never understood. He thought he was playing a game. But you were enacting a ritual, a sacred, brutal ceremony to bury your past and crown your rage. He thought you were coming to compete. He didn't know you were coming to cleanse, not for glory, for closure. You didn't just humiliate him, you unmade him, like a god snapping a statue in half and saying, "This was never worthy of worship." The crowd still hasn't recovered. They're stuck, frozen in that moment. The moment you cracked the oxygen out of the room, and their favorite fool hit the floor with reality carved across his face. They used to cheer for him. Now they don't even speak his name, because you didn't just beat him. You erased the belief that he was ever untouchable. He was arrogance in designer clothes. You were a pain in armor, and no matter how pretty his confidence looked, it bled the same. And now that it's done, now that the ashes are cold, now comes the transformation no one can undo. Because once you destroy someone this brutally, that you don't go back. You don't become normal again. You don't get to be relatable. You become a symbol, a curse word in the mouths of the proud, a ghost story the next fool will hear before they dare challenge you. They'll say things like, "He was always intense. She snapped one day. They changed after that win." No, you didn't snap. You activated. This wasn't you becoming something new. This was you unleashing what you've always been. The monster behind the smile. The beast behind the kindness. The last breath before someone learns why mercy was never an option. And the beauty of it all? You still haven't gone all out. You still held a piece of yourself back. Because this wasn't your final form. Oh, no, no, no. This was just the trailer. The preview. The first sermon in a cathedral of carnage. And the next time someone gets brave. The next time someone thinks your silence is weakness. They won't just remember what happened to the cocky fool. They'll remember how fast the world turned cold. How the air left the room. How you smiled like it was nothing. Because to you, it was nothing. Just another lesson, just another soul tax. For thinking you were soft, so let them fear you. Let them doubt you once. Let them stare when you enter the room. Because now, you don't have to fight. You don't have to speak. You don't even have to move. Your reputation fights for you now. Your legacy walks ahead of you. You are the one whose silence echoes louder than their screams. You are the one whose power speaks in whispers. Because everyone already knows what happens when you get loud. And trust me, they'd rather forget how to breathe than remember what it's like to see you unchained. The Joker bows. The crowd doesn't clap. They just watch. Frozen, stunned, and forever haunted. Because once you destroy the fool, you don't become a champion. You become a myth. Hehehe.